Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't losing everything, it's facing the people you love when you have nothing left to show them. Philip Garrett knew that feeling well when he returned to his late father's old property at 46, jobless and broken, with nothing but a strange idea and worn-out hands. His family laughed at him for building a treehouse in the giant oak instead of looking for real work. But Philip kept building anyway. Then one afternoon, while carving into the ancient trunk, he discovered a hidden wooden door sealed shut for decades. Behind it was a secret room his grandfather had built during the Great Depression. What he found inside changed everything. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Philip Garrett had always been good with his hands. That's what people said about him anyway, back when saying it meant something. Back when he had a job, a reputation, a reason to wake up in the morning beyond the simple fact that the sun had risen and another day demanded to be endured. Now, at 46, he sat on the sagging porch of his father's cabin and watched the morning light filter through the canopy of the massive oak tree that dominated the property. 8 acres of overgrown woodland in the hill country, 2 hours from anything resembling civilization, and a cabin that smelled like mildew and memories. This was what remained of his inheritance. This and the silence that came with failure. The layoff had happened 4 months ago. Senior master carpenter at Westfield Construction. 22 years of service, countless projects, buildings that would stand for generations bearing his craftsmanship, even if they'd never bear his name. None of it had mattered when the company restructured. The younger guys cost less. The corporate office in Dallas wanted to trim overhead. Philip had received a handshake, 2 weeks severance, and a speech about market conditions from a manager half his age who couldn't tell a miter saw from a coping saw. The savings had lasted 6 weeks. Then came the hard decisions. The apartment they couldn't afford. The meals that got simpler and scarcer. The look in his wife Brenda's eyes that shifted from concern to something harder, something that felt like disappointment wearing the mask of determination. Brenda, 22 years of marriage, and he'd never seen her work as hard as she did now. Double shifts at County General, pulling overtime in the emergency room, coming home with exhaustion carved into every line of her face. She was 51 and looked older lately. He knew he was the reason why. She hadn't complained when he suggested moving to his father's place. The cabin had been sitting empty for 3 years since the old man's heart finally quit on him while he was splitting firewood. At least it was free, at least it was shelter. Those were the words they used instead of admitting what it really was. Retreat, surrender, the place you went when you ran out of options and pride. Their children had opinions about the move. Plenty of them. Trevor, their eldest at 24, had made his disapproval clear during a phone call that Philip kept mercifully short. Trevor worked as an accountant for an investment firm in the city, wore suits that cost more than Philip used to make in a week, and had apparently absorbed the notion that a man's worth could be measured in his portfolio and his title. The disappointment in his son's voice had been acid. "Dad, this is insane. You're living in Grandpa's hunting cabin like some kind of hermit. What are you even doing out there? You need to be sending out resumes, networking, getting back into the market." Philip had tried to explain that he was sending out resumes, dozens of them, into a void that never responded. But Trevor had already moved on, already categorized his father's situation into a neat column of poor life choices and salvageable mistakes. Allison, 19 and halfway through her sophomore year at State, had been quieter but no less cutting. She'd come home for a weekend, taken one look at the cabin, at the woods, at the life her parents were cobbling together from scraps, and spent most of her visit on her phone. When she left, she'd hugged Brenda tight and given Philip a kiss on the cheek that felt like obligation. Later, Brenda had found her crying in the car before she drove back to campus. "She's embarrassed," Brenda had said that night, lying in the dark beside him in a bed that creaked with every movement. "She's 19. Her friends' parents have lake houses and new cars. We're living in a cabin with no internet and a bathroom that barely works." Philip had stared at the ceiling and said nothing. Because what was there to say? Yes, he'd failed. Yes, he'd let everyone down. Yes, he was the reason his daughter cried in parking lots and his son spoke to him like a problem to be solved. The oak tree had been here longer than any of them. 300 years, maybe more, his father used to say. The trunk was enormous, nearly 20 feet in circumference at the base, bark rough and deeply furrowed, branches spreading out like the fingers of some ancient giant reaching for the sky. Philip's father had loved this tree, had taken him climbing in it when Philip was young, pointing out the hollow places where animals nested, the way the branches formed natural seats and platforms. One day, his father had said more than once, we're going to build something special here, something that lasts. They never had. Life got in the way, jobs, responsibilities, the 1,000 small urgencies that accumulated into years. And then his father was gone, and the tree stood alone, waiting. Philip noticed the hollow opening one morning during his second week at the cabin. He'd been clearing brush away from the base, trying to make the place look less like it had been abandoned to the forest. When he saw it, a space in the trunk large enough to step into, hidden behind a curtain of vines and decades of growth. The hollow extended deep into the trunk. He'd crawled inside with a flashlight, amazed at the space within. The heartwood had rotted away long ago, leaving a chamber easily 8 feet across, the walls solid and dry. Light filtered down from gaps high above where branches had broken away. It smelled like old wood and earth, not unpleasant, almost comforting. An idea took root, slow at first, just a whisper, then stronger. What if he built something here? Not just something, a treehouse. A real one, built partially into this hollow, extending out into the branches. Something his father had talked about but never made. Something that required every bit of skill Philip had spent decades developing. Something that had nothing to do with resumes or job markets or proving his worth to people who'd already written him off. He mentioned it casually at dinner 3 weeks into their stay at the cabin. Brenda had made spaghetti, stretching a pound of ground beef across 3 meals worth of pasta. Trevor had come by unexpectedly, bringing his fiancée Stephanie, and Allison was home for the weekend again. I've been thinking, Philip said, twirling pasta on his fork. That big oak out there, it has a hollow space in the trunk. Pretty substantial. I thought I might build a treehouse. Use the hollow as the foundation, extend it out into the branches. The silence that followed felt heavy. Trevor set down his fork. A treehouse. Dad, you need a job, Trevor said, his voice carrying that particular tone of patience stretched thin. Not a hobby? Not a project. An actual job with a paycheck. I'm looking for work, Philip said quietly. I look every day, but nothing's... Then look harder. Trevor's jaw tightened. This is getting ridiculous. You're living out here like you've given up. Building a treehouse. Seriously? What are you, 12? Allison wouldn't meet his eyes. Stephanie, whom Philip had met exactly twice, looked uncomfortable. Brenda didn't say anything at all. Later that night, after the kids had left and the dishes were washed, Brenda sat across from him at the small kitchen table. How long? She asked. How long what? How long are you going to do this? The treehouse thing. How long before you go back to looking for real work? I'm looking for real work. The treehouse wouldn't stop that. It would just be, he struggled for the words, something to do while I wait. Something to build. She looked tired. More than tired. We're barely making it, Philip. I'm working 60-hour weeks. We're behind on the insurance. The truck needs new brakes. And you want to spend time building a treehouse? He couldn't explain it to her. Couldn't put into words the feeling that had been growing in his chest since he'd found that hollow space. The sense that maybe, just maybe, building something with his own hands, for no other reason than because he wanted to, might be the first honest thing he'd done in years. I need this, he finally said. She'd looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Then she'd gone to bed, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his strange, stubborn idea. His father's brother Gerald had stopped by a few days later. Gerald owned a hardware store in the nearest town, a place called Pinehaven, about 40 minutes down the mountain. He'd always been the successful one, the brother who'd made something of himself, and he'd never let anyone forget it. He'd found Philip sketching plans on graph paper at the kitchen table. "What's this?" Gerald had asked, picking up the drawings. "Treehouse plans." "For the oak," Gerald had laughed. Actually laughed. "Brenda called me. Said you were having some kind of breakdown. Guess she wasn't exaggerating. I'm not having a breakdown." "No? What do you call this then? Running away from responsibility? Playing in the woods while your wife works herself to death?" Gerald had tossed the drawings back on the table. "I offered you a job at the store." "Cashier work, sure, but it's something." "You said no. Too proud, I guess. But not too proud to waste time on this." Philip had felt anger rise in his throat, hot and bitter. But he'd swallowed it down. "I appreciate your concern, Gerald." "Concern? I'm trying to help you. This family has a reputation in this town. Your father was respected. You're making us all look. I think you should go." Gerald had gone, but not before making sure Philip knew exactly what he thought of the whole situation. That afternoon, Philip had taken his father's old toolbox from the shed and started working. He'd begun by clearing the area around the oak's base, then carefully examined the hollow, testing the wood, checking for rot or instability. The tree was sound, strong. It had weathered 3 centuries of storms. It could hold what he wanted to build. As the sun set that first day, he drilled the first hole, sunk the first bolt, and felt something in his chest ease just slightly, like a clenched fist finally opening. He was building. That's what he did. That's who he was, regardless of what anyone else thought. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. 3 weeks into unemployment, Philip had settled into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like ritual. Wake before dawn. Make coffee on the old propane stove. Spend the morning sending resumes into the digital void. Then when the futility of it became too much, he'd walk out to the oak tree and work. The tree didn't judge, didn't send automated rejection emails, didn't tell him he was overqualified or underqualified or that they'd gone with someone else. The tree just stood there, solid and patient, waiting for him to figure out what he was building. He'd been clearing debris from around the base when he found it, half buried in decades of leaf litter and soil, tangled in the roots like the tree had been holding onto it all this time. A hand saw, old and rusted, but the shape still unmistakable. The wooden handle had weathered grey, but when he brushed the dirt away, he could see letters carved into it. W.G. Walter Garrett. His grandfather. Philip sat back on his heels, holding the saw like it might dissolve if he gripped too hard. He'd never known Walter. The man had died in 1965, years before Philip was born. But his father had talked about him, always with a particular tone in his voice, something between reverence and sadness. "Your grandfather could build anything from nothing," his father used to say. Depression hit, he lost everything. But he had his hands and his tools, and that was enough. He built half the houses in this county, 1 nail at a time. Philip turned the saw over in his hands. Imagined Walter using it. Imagined him working in these same woods, maybe even on this same tree. The connection felt tangible, like a thread pulled tight across decades. He looked up at the oak, really looked at it, and the hollow space seemed different now, bigger, more possible. Not just an empty place, but an invitation. That night he worked on his sketches until past midnight, refining the design. A platform built partially inside the hollow, using the tree's natural structure for support. Walls extending out, following the curve of the branches. Windows to catch the morning light. A door carved right into the trunk itself. It would take time. Careful work! Every skill he'd developed over 22 years of carpentry. He could do this. He knew he could. The next evening, the family gathered for dinner again. Brenda had made chicken and rice, stretching the meat thin. The conversation was sparse, careful, everyone avoiding the topics that mattered. Philip set down his fork and cleared his throat. "I'm going to do it," he said. "The treehouse. I'm starting this week." Trevor looked up from his plate. "Dad, we talked about this." "You talked. I listened. Now I'm telling you what I've decided." Philip kept his voice level. "I'll keep looking for work. I'll send out resumes every morning. But in the afternoons, I'm building." "Building what?" Allison asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Why? What's the point?" How could he explain it? The saw with his grandfather's initials. The feeling that he was supposed to find it, supposed to be here, supposed to do this thing that made no logical sense. The point is that I need to build something, he said finally. Something that's mine. Something that matters. What matters is paying bills, Trevor said. What matters is being responsible. Brenda's voice cut through quiet but sharp. Trevor, enough. Trevor turned to her. Mom, you can't actually support this. You're killing yourself working double shifts while Dad plays carpenter in the woods. I said enough. Brenda's face was tight. Your father is a grown man. He can make his own decisions. It wasn't support exactly, but it wasn't condemnation either. Philip caught her eye across the table and saw something complicated there. Exhaustion, yes, but also maybe understanding, or at least acceptance. After dinner, Trevor pulled him aside on the porch. This is a mistake, he said, voice low so the others wouldn't hear. People are talking. Uncle Gerald told everyone at the hardware store that you've lost it, that you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Maybe I am, Philip said. That's not funny. I'm not joking. Philip leaned against the porch rail. Maybe this is what a crisis looks like. Or maybe it's what finding your way back looks like. I don't know yet. Trevor shook his head. I have to get back to the city. Stephanie and I have plans. He paused at the steps. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Philip said quietly, but Trevor was already walking to his car. The next morning, Mrs. Sutherland appeared at the edge of the property. She was 78, a widow who lived in the old farmhouse down the road. Philip had seen her around but never really talked to her. Heard you're working on the oak, she said, leaning on her walking stick. Word travels fast. Small town. Not much else to talk about. She looked up at the tree with something like affection. Your grandfather built my front porch. Summer of 1955. I was just married then. We couldn't afford much, but Walter said he'd do it for whatever we could pay. We gave him $60 and a bushel of tomatoes from our garden. She smiled at the memory. That porch is still solid. Not a board out of place. Philip felt something warm in his chest. I didn't know that. Walter was a good man. Quiet, but good. He understood that building things wasn't just about the wood and nails. It was about making something that would last longer than you did. She studied Philip with sharp eyes. I expect you understand that too. After she left, Philip stood looking at the saw in his hands, then up at the oak. 300 years old. His grandfather had worked in its shadow, built things that lasted, things that mattered. Maybe that was enough of a reason. He spent the rest of that day cutting into the trunk, carving the opening wider, creating the doorway that would lead into the hollow space. The work was slow, methodical, satisfying, each cut deliberate, each measurement precise. As the sun set and the woods filled with the sound of evening insects, Philip stood back and looked at what he'd done. Just the beginning, just the first real step. But it was something real and solid and his. That night, lying in bed while Brenda slept beside him, Philip thought about Walter. About a man who'd lost everything in 1929 and rebuilt his life one project at a time. About resilience and purpose and the quiet dignity of work done well. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, he whispered to the darkness. But I know I have to do it. Brenda's hand found his in the dark and squeezed once. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Outside, the oak tree stood silent against the stars, waiting to become something more than it had been. Waiting for Philip to figure out what he was really building and why. The answer, he suspected, was buried somewhere in that hollow space, along with whatever else his grandfather might have left behind. 2 months passed in a blur of sawdust and silence. Philip fell into a pattern that felt less like living and more like existing in parallel to the life he'd known before. Mornings belonged to the fruitless hunt for employment, applications submitted to companies that never responded, calls to contacts who'd gone suddenly quiet, the slow erosion of hope that came with every automated rejection. But afternoons belonged to the tree. The work progressed slowly, which somehow made it more satisfying. He'd built the basic platform inside the hollow first, using pressure-treated lumber he'd bought with money he probably shouldn't have spent. The space was larger than he'd initially thought, a good 8 feet by 10, once he'd cleaned it out and reinforced the walls. Natural light filtered down from gaps in the canopy above, and he'd installed a simple ladder that descended from the opening he'd carved in the trunk. It was taking shape, becoming real. The bank notices had started arriving in the 3rd week, past due statements with increasingly urgent language. Brenda handled them without comment, filing them in a folder that grew thicker each week. She'd picked up another shift rotation at the hospital, overnight on weekends now, which meant Philip barely saw her, except in passing. The insurance had lapsed. That had been a quiet conversation over coffee one morning, Brenda's voice matter-of-fact as she delivered the news. "We'll get it back when things improve," she'd said, but they both knew what things improving actually meant, and neither of them believed it was coming soon. Trevor had visited again in the 6th week, unannounced as usual. He'd found Philip installing support beams deep inside the hollow, working by the light of a battery-powered lantern. "Still at it," Trevor said from the doorway Philip had carved. Not a question. "Still at it," Philip confirmed, not looking up from his work. "The partners at my firm asked about you last week." "About what you're doing out here?" Trevor's voice had an edge to it. "I didn't know what to tell them. You could try the truth." "Which is what, exactly? That my father is building a treehouse instead of supporting his family?" Philip set down his drill and finally looked at his son. 24 years old and already carrying the weight of certainty, the conviction that there was a right way to live, and his father had strayed from it. "Your mother is supporting this family just fine," Philip said quietly. "And I'm doing what I need to do. What you need to do is grow up." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Trevor left without saying goodbye. That same afternoon, while Philip was working on interior supports, his drill bit caught on something unexpected. Not wood, something harder. Metal. He switched to a smaller bit and carefully worked around it until he could see what he'd hit. A brass compass, wedged tight in a crack in the trunk wall. Old. The surface tarnished dark, but when he worked it free and cleaned it with his shirt, he could make out an engraving on the back. "To Walter, find your way home, 1929. Philip sat on his half-finished platform, turning the compass over in his hands. 1929, the year the stock market crashed. The year the Great Depression began. His grandfather would have been 28, the same age Philip had been when Trevor was born. Young enough to still believe the world made sense, old enough to feel the full weight when it stopped making sense. Someone had given Walter this compass that year, a reminder maybe when everything else was falling apart. Find your way home. That evening, Philip drove into town to the small public library, waited his turn on one of their ancient computers, and searched for information about Walter Garrett. He found a few census records, an obituary from the local paper dated April 1965. Not much else. The past had a way of swallowing ordinary people whole, leaving barely a trace. But Mrs. Sutherland had remembered him, had remembered the porch he'd built. The next day Philip knocked on her door. She invited him in for coffee, and they sat in her kitchen while she told him stories. Walter had been quiet, she said, but kind. Had lost his small farm in 29, lost everything really, but refused to leave the county. Had taught himself carpentry and spent the next decade building for anyone who needed it, taking payment in whatever people could spare. Chickens, vegetables, labor traded for labor. He built during the worst of it, Mrs. Sutherland said, stirring sugar into her coffee. When other men were giving up, jumping off buildings in the cities, your grandfather just kept building. One board at a time, one nail at a time. Like if he stopped, he'd disappear. Philip thought about that on the drive back. About building as a way to remain visible, to matter, to leave marks on the world that said you'd been here and done something worth doing. Back at the Oak, he completed the interior room. 8 by 10 feet of solid workspace, surprisingly cozy, despite being inside a tree trunk. He installed reclaimed windows he'd found at a demolition site. The contractor there had just waved him off, told him to take whatever he wanted from the scrap pile. Small mercies. Allison came home that weekend, barely spoke to him. Spent most of Saturday on her phone, Sunday morning packing to leave again. When she hugged Brenda goodbye, Philip saw his daughter's eyes were red. Later, Brenda found him in the tree. "She's struggling," Brenda said, standing at the base of the ladder. Her roommate's family took them on a cruise over spring break. She had to tell them she couldn't go, because we can't afford it. Philip closed his eyes. "I didn't know. She didn't tell you because she knew you'd feel guilty." Brenda's voice wasn't accusing, just tired. "When does this end, Philip? The building, the hiding out here, when does it end?" He wanted to tell her he didn't know. Wanted to tell her about the compass, about Walter building through the depression, about the feeling that he was working towards something even if he couldn't name it yet. Instead, he said, "Soon." She nodded and went back inside, and Philip knew she didn't believe him any more than he believed himself. That night he started a journal. Nothing fancy, just a cheap notebook from the dollar store. He wrote about finding the compass, about what Mrs. Sutherland had told him, about the feeling that he was following footsteps laid down 90 years ago by a man he'd never met but somehow understood. "I don't know what I'm doing," he wrote, "but I think you did, Grandpa. I think you knew exactly what you were doing. I hope wherever this leads, it's somewhere worth going." He tucked the compass into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his heart like a talisman. Find your way home. He was trying. God help him, he was trying. 3 months into the project, the treehouse had walls. Real walls with windows that opened and closed. Salvaged wood siding that Philip had carefully fitted and sealed. It was becoming more than a hollow space with a platform. It was becoming a room. A place. Something that existed in the world with purpose and shape. He'd been installing interior shelving when he found it, tucked into a small cavity he'd uncovered while smoothing the inner wall of the trunk. A wooden bird, hand-carved, small enough to fit in his palm. A robin, he thought, though time had worn away some of the detail. When he turned it over, he found words scratched into the base in a child's uneven hand. For Philip's father, age 7. His breath caught. His father, 7 years old. Walter had carved this for his son, Philip's father, and hidden it here. Or maybe his father had hidden it here himself. A treasure tucked away in a secret place, the way children do, meaning to come back for it someday, and then forgetting as childhood gave way to other things. Philip sat on the floor of his half-finished treehouse and held his father's childhood toy, and something broke open in his chest. His father had played in this tree, had climbed these same branches, explored this same hollow. The tree had been part of his world the way it was becoming part of Philip's. Why had his father never built here himself? Had never come back to this place with his own son the way Walter had come with him? The memories surfaced slowly. His father's funeral 3 years ago. The service brief, the attendance sparse. Philip had stood at the grave, feeling disconnected, guilty that he hadn't visited more in those final years, hadn't made time, had let work and obligations fill the space where relationship should have been. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered now to the empty treehouse. "I didn't know this mattered to you. Didn't know you wanted this, but maybe that was the point. Maybe his father had wanted it and never done it, and now Philip was doing it for both of them, finishing something that had waited generations to be finished." That weekend, Trevor came by with Stephanie, timing the visit for when Philip would be working on the tree. They went straight to the cabin, spent an hour with Brenda, and left without coming to see what he was building. Brenda told him about it that evening while they ate leftover soup. "They're getting married in October," she said. "Stephanie's family is paying for most of it. Trevor wanted to know if we could contribute something, anything." Philip set down his spoon. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd do what we could." Her voice was flat, exhausted. "He's ashamed of us, Philip, of you. He made Stephanie park around back so the neighbors wouldn't see their car here." The words should have hurt more than they did. Maybe Philip had grown calluses against that particular pain. "I found something today," he said instead. "In the tree." He showed her the carved bird, told her about the inscription, watched her face soften as she held it, turning it over in her hands the way he had. "Your father never talked about this tree," she said quietly. "All the years I knew him, he never once mentioned it. Maybe it hurt too much. Maybe he left it behind when he left home and couldn't figure out how to come back to it. Brenda looked at him across the table. Is that what you're doing? Coming back to something? I think so. I'm just not sure what yet. She handed the bird back to him. Trevor's angry because he's scared. He sees you struggling and doesn't know how to help, so he gets angry instead. It's easier. I know, but he's not wrong that we're barely holding on. I know that too. She reached across and squeezed his hand. I'm not asking you to stop. I just need you to know that I can't keep doing this forever. The double shifts, the overtime. I'm 51 years old, and my body is starting to tell me things it didn't used to. I'll find something. I will. She nodded, but her eyes said she'd heard that promise before. The next week brought small mercies. Uncle Gerald stopped by, not to argue this time, but to tell Philip that people in town were talking. Not all of it bad. Old Pete Halverson mentioned your Walter's grandson, Gerald said, standing by the tree. Said Walter built his barn in 34, still standing, still solid. Pete asked me what you were building out here. What did you tell him? That I didn't know. That you'd lost your mind, probably. Gerald's mouth twitched. But he seemed interested. Said if you ever wanted work, he's got a shed that needs replacing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mrs. Sutherland came by more often now, bringing lunch sometimes, sitting on an old folding chair and watching Philip work. She told more stories about Walter, about the Depression years, about how the community had survived by helping each other in ways that had nothing to do with money. Nobody had cash, she said one afternoon, but everybody had something. Skills, time, muscle. Walter had his hands and his knowledge. He gave those freely, and people remembered. Still remember, even now. A younger man showed up one morning, mid-30s, contractor's tan, wearing work clothes. He introduced himself as Felix Russo, said he'd heard about the Treehouse project from the guys at the lumber yard. I run a small crew doing renovation work, Felix said, walking around the oak, examining Philip's craftsmanship. This is solid work, really solid. Where'd you learn? 22 years in commercial construction. Master carpenter. No kidding. Felix looked at the treehouse with new appreciation. Listen, I get surplus materials from job sites all the time. Stuff that's going to get tossed. You want it, it's yours. Better it gets used than thrown away. Philip started to refuse. Pride, habit, the instinct not to take charity, but Felix held up a hand. Not charity. Professional courtesy. Good work deserves good materials. He handed Philip a business card. Call me when you need something. I'll see what I can do. After Felix left, Philip stood holding the card and feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but maybe hope's distant cousin. The sense that he wasn't completely alone in this strange thing he was doing. That night, he worked on the carved bird, carefully sanding away decades of grime, treating the wood to bring back some of its original color. When he was done, it looked almost new. A robin in mid-flight, wings spread, beak open like it was singing. He set it on the shelf in his treehouse room, next to the compass. Walter's gift to his son, now Philip's inheritance from both of them. Outside, the evening settled in cool and quiet. Philip lit the battery lantern and sat in the space he'd built, surrounded by walls he'd raised with his own hands, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. 4 months into the project, autumn began creeping into the edges of summer. The tree house was nearly complete, walls finished, roof secure, windows installed and sealed. Philip had even run a small solar panel to power LED lights and charge his phone. The space felt solid, real, permanent in a way that contrasted sharply with the impermanence of everything else in his life. He was finishing the interior walls when his drill caught on something unexpected. Not metal this time, but wood, hollow-sounding, deliberate. He tapped along the trunk's inner surface until he found the edges. A board carefully fitted into the wall, designed to look like part of the tree itself. It took 20 minutes of careful prying to work it loose without damaging anything. Behind it, tucked into a carved-out space in the trunk, was a tin box. The box was old, rusted at the corners but still sealed tight. Philip carried it down from the tree and into the cabin, setting it on the kitchen table like it might explode if handled roughly. His hands shook slightly as he worked the lid open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, brown and faded, but preserved well enough to make out faces. A young man and woman standing in front of the oak tree, Walter and his wife Constance, Philip guessed. The same couple in other photos, older now, with a small boy between them. Philip's father as a child. There were more. The family in different seasons, different years. Walter building something, hammer in hand. Constance hanging laundry. The boy climbing in the oak's branches, grinning at the camera. Beneath the photographs were letters, folded pieces of paper, some brittle with age, written in careful script. Philip opened one. "Dear Walter, thank you for the cabinets. They are beautiful and sturdy. We have no money now, but in spring we will have chickens, and you will have eggs for your kindness. God bless you." The Havisham family. Another letter. "Walter, you fixed our roof when we could not. Take these preserves, and know our family will not forget what you did. We are grateful." More letters, all similar. Thanking Walter for building things, fixing things, helping when help was needed. Payment offered in vegetables, labor, gratitude. Never money, because nobody had money. At the bottom of the box was a small ledger. Philip opened it carefully. Page after page of entries in Walter's handwriting, listing projects, dates, what he'd been paid. March 1933, built crib for Havisham baby. Payment, 1 chicken. April 1933, repaired Morrison porch. Payment, bushel of potatoes. June 1933, built bookshelf for widow Preston. Payment, her late husband's tools. The entries went on for years. Hundreds of projects, none of them paid for with actual money. All of them paid for with whatever people could spare, whatever they had to give. Philip sat at the table as the afternoon light faded, reading through his grandfather's accounting of the Depression years. This was Walter's legacy. Not wealth accumulated, not property acquired, but things built and people helped and community sustained when sustaining it seemed impossible. That evening, Brenda came home exhausted from a double shift. She found Philip still at the table, surrounded by photographs and letters.
"What's all this?"
she asked, dropping into a chair. He showed her, told her about finding the tin box, about what it contained. She picked up photographs one by one, studying the faces of people long dead, the tree in its younger days, the life that had unfolded in its shadow. "He was poor," she said finally. "Yes, but he wasn't, was he? Not really?" She held up one of the thank you letters. "Look at this. Look at how they talk about him. Like he was wealthy beyond measure." Philip felt something shift in his understanding. He gave what he had, and what he had was worth more than money. Brenda looked at him with something new in her eyes. "Is that what you're doing out there? Building something worth more than money?" "I don't know. Maybe I'm just trying to figure out what I have that's worth giving." She reached across and took his hand. For the first time in months, her grip felt less like obligation and more like choice. "Maybe you're figuring out what we have." The next week, a small article appeared in the Pinehaven Gazette. Someone, Philip never found out who, had contacted the local paper about the Treehouse project. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs, but it told the story. Local man building tribute to his grandfather's Depression-era legacy, honoring family history through craftsmanship. The response surprised him. Mrs. Sutherland brought the paper by, grinning like she'd won something. "Half the town's talking about it," she said. "The old-timers, anyway. Pete Halverson called me this morning. Said his father used to talk about Walter Garrett like he was some kind of saint, but not everyone approved." Allison called that night, her voice tight with something between embarrassment and anger. "Did you have to talk to the newspaper?" she demanded. "I didn't talk to anyone. Someone else. It's online now. My classmates are seeing it. They're asking me about my dad, who lives in the woods building tree houses. Do you know how that sounds?" Philip closed his eyes. "I'm sorry you're embarrassed. I'm not—" She stopped. "I just don't understand why you're doing this. Why this matters more than getting a real job, more than helping Mom, more than anything else. It doesn't matter more. It just matters differently." She hung up without saying goodbye. Uncle Gerald showed up the next day, the newspaper folded under his arm. Philip expected another lecture, another speech about family reputation and responsibility. Instead, Gerald stood by the tree for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, I found a letter once, from Walter. After he died, going through Dad's things. Gerald's voice was quieter than Philip had ever heard it. It was about me. About how I was always chasing success, always needing to be the important one. Walter wrote that he worried I'd never figure out that building yourself up by tearing others down just leaves everybody shorter. Gerald, I've spent 30 years proving I'm better than everyone else. Better than my brother. Better than you. Building this big important life. He looked at the treehouse, then at Philip. But I don't have anything like that. Nothing I've built that'll outlast me. Nothing that means a damn to anyone but me. They stood together in silence, two men carrying their own versions of failure, their own forms of being lost. It's good work, Gerald said finally. Walter would be proud. After he left, Philip climbed back into the treehouse and sat among his grandfather's artifacts, the compass, the carved bird, the photographs, the letters. Evidence of a life lived deliberately, purposefully, in service to something larger than just survival. Maybe that was what he was building. Not just a treehouse, but proof that he could still create something meaningful. That his hands still worked. That he still mattered. Outside, the sun set through the branches, painting everything gold. 5 months in, and the treehouse was more than finished. It was refined. Philip had added small touches that elevated it beyond simple construction. Hand-carved trim around the windows. A built-in bench beneath the main window. Careful sanding that made every surface smooth to the touch. The space felt intentional, loved, permanent. He was organizing the interior one afternoon when he found it. Another hidden compartment, this one behind where the photographs had been stored. His fingers found the edge of something leather-bound, and when he worked it free, he held a journal. The cover was worn soft with age, the binding fragile but intact. On the first page, in careful script, property of Walter Garrett, 1930. Philip carried it down to the cabin and spent the rest of that day reading. The entries started simple, lists of projects, materials needed, work completed. But as the depression deepened, Walter's writings became more reflective, almost philosophical. Philip found himself reading passages multiple times, feeling his grandfather's words speak directly across the decades. September 1931. Built fence for the Murphy farm today. They paid me with a side of beef. Martha will be pleased. More than the meat, though, I'm pleased to have built something solid. When everything else is falling apart, a good fence stands. A man needs to build things that stand. January 1932, 10 degrees today. No work, no prospects. Money gone. Sat in the barn and considered whether continuing was worth the effort. Then remembered the crib I built for the Havisham baby last year. Saw the child in town last week, healthy and growing. That crib will hold more children, maybe grandchildren someday. I built something that will outlast me. That has to count for something. Philip's throat tightened. Walter had been there, in that dark place where continuing seemed harder than stopping. And he'd found his way through by remembering what his hands had made, what he'd contributed. March 1933. A man came to me today, asked me to build kitchen cabinets. Said he had no money, only potatoes from his cellar. I took the potatoes, built the cabinets. Realized something while working. A man isn't measured by what he earns, but by what he builds that outlasts him. The cabinets will be there when both of us are dust. That's wealth of a different kind. The entries continued through the years. Walter documenting not just what he built, but why it mattered. How it connected him to his community, to his family, to something larger than his own survival. One entry from 1935 stopped Philip cold. Today I built a crib for the Havisham baby. They paid me with a chicken and gratitude. I am rich, not in money, I have almost none, but in purpose, in the knowledge that my hands serve something good. I think about my son sometimes, what I'll tell him when he's old enough to understand. I'll tell him this: the world will try to measure you by your bank account, your title, your possessions. Don't believe it. You are measured by what you give when you have nothing, by what you build that helps others stand. Philip closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin. His grandfather had understood, had faced the same doubts, the same fears, the same crushing weight of feeling worthless in a world that measured worth in dollars. That evening, when Brenda came home, he was waiting for her. He'd made dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce from a jar, and he'd set the journal on the table between them. "Read this," he said, handing it to her. "Start with the entry from January 1932. She read while they ate, slowly turning pages, her expression changing as she absorbed Walter's words. When she finished, there were tears on her cheeks. "Oh, Philip," she said softly. "I know. He was where you are, exactly where you are." "Yes." She reached across and took his hand. "I'm sorry. I've been so angry at you for not being practical, for not doing what made sense. But this," she touched the journal, "this is about more than sense, isn't it?" "I think so. I think I've been trying to find what Walter found. Some way to matter that doesn't depend on a paycheck or a job title or anyone else's approval." They talked late into the night, really talked for the first time in months, about fear and failure and the ways they'd both been measuring wrong things, about how her anger had been about terror that they'd lose everything, that he'd given up, that she was alone in holding their family together. "I haven't given up," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to keep going. The tree, the building, it's kept me alive, Brenda. Kept me from disappearing. I see that now. I do." The next weekend, Trevor came by with Stephanie to discuss wedding plans. This time he asked to see the treehouse. Really see it, not just dismiss it from a distance. Philip showed them everything. The craftsmanship, the hidden chamber where he'd found the artifacts, the journal with Walter's words. Trevor picked up the carved bird, turning it over in his hands. "Grandpa made this?" "For your grandfather." "My father." Trevor was quiet for a long moment. "I remember you making me things when I was little. A toy box, a bookshelf shaped like a castle." He looked at his father. "I still have the castle. It's in my closet." Stephanie, who'd been studying the journal, looked up. "This is beautiful. The whole story, it's beautiful. Trevor told me you were having a breakdown, but this isn't that at all, is it?" "No," Philip said. "It's the opposite." Trevor set down the bird carefully. "I'm sorry, Dad. I've been an ass about all this." "You've been scared. I understand. Doesn't make it right." Trevor looked around the treehouse. "This is really good work, like professional quality. I was a professional for 22 years. I know. I guess I forgot that you weren't just my dad who lost his job. You're someone who builds things, really builds them." They spent the afternoon in and around the tree, talking more honestly than they had in years. Trevor asked about Walter, about the depression, about what Philip had learned from his grandfather's journal. Stephanie asked if she could photograph the space. She worked in marketing and thought the story would resonate with people. Before they left, Trevor hugged his father. Actually hugged him, not the brief masculine clasp they usually managed, but a real embrace. "I'm proud of you," Trevor said. "I should have said that sooner." After they left, Philip sat in the treehouse alone and opened his own journal, a cheap notebook he'd been writing in for weeks now, mirroring his grandfather's practice. He wrote about the day, about Trevor's words, about finding Walter's journal. And then he wrote, "I'm starting to understand what I'm building. Not just a treehouse, not just a monument to the past. I'm building a way forward. I'm building proof that a man's worth isn't found in what he's lost, but in what he still has to give." Outside, the first leaves of autumn began to fall. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September. Philip had been doing final detail work, installing a small shelf along the inner wall of the trunk, when his drill bit punched through into empty space where there shouldn't have been any. He stopped, pulled the bit out, and examined the hole he'd made. Air moved through it, not the dead stillness of solid wood, but a current that suggested space behind the wall. He tapped along the surface, listening. The sound changed in a rectangular pattern, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. Another hidden panel, but this one was different, larger, more deliberately concealed. The edges had been sealed with some kind of pitch or resin that had hardened over decades into something like stone. It took him 2 hours to work it free, carefully prying and chipping without damaging the surrounding wood. When the panel finally came loose, he found himself looking at a door. A real door, hand-carved, fitted so precisely into the trunk's interior that it had become almost invisible over time. The door had a simple latch, corroded with age. Philip worked it carefully until it gave way with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. Behind the door was darkness, complete and absolute. Philip retrieved his flashlight and shone it through the opening. The beam revealed a chamber, small, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, carved deep into the tree's hollow core. He could see the edges of furniture, the shapes of objects, everything covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested no air had stirred in this space for decades. His heart hammered as he squeezed through the opening. The chamber was just tall enough to stand in, the walls smoothed and finished with the same care as everything else Walter had built. There was a small table, a chair, an oil lamp. Hand tools hung on wooden pegs driven into the wall. Toys, wooden animals, a small train, a doll, lined one shelf. And on the table, propped against the wall, was an envelope. The paper was yellowed but intact, protected from moisture by the sealed nature of the space. Written across the front in Walter's careful script, "To whoever finds this room." Philip's hand shook as he picked it up. He carried it back out into the main treehouse space, where the light was better, sat down on his built-in bench, and opened it. The letter inside was dated April 1936. "To whoever finds this room, if you're reading this, you've done what I hoped someone would eventually do. You've built something in this tree. You've seen its potential and made it real. That tells me something about you. It tells me you understand that building is more than putting boards together. It's about creating something that matters. I want to tell you why this room exists. In the spring of 1932, I climbed up into this tree with a rope and serious intentions. The Depression had taken everything from me. My farm was gone, sold for debts I couldn't pay. My savings were worthless. I had a wife and a young son, and I couldn't provide for them. I couldn't see a way forward that didn't involve more loss, more failure, more of the crushing weight of being a man who'd let his family down. I stood on a branch with that rope, and I looked out over this land that used to be mine, and I thought about how much easier it would be to just stop, to let go, to not have to face another day of not being enough. But then I looked at the tree itself. 300 years old, people said. It had weathered storms and droughts and fires and kept growing, kept standing, and I thought about what it took to stand for 300 years. Not strength that never breaks, but the kind of strength that bends and holds and endures. I came down from that branch, put the rope away, and I started building. First I built this secret room deep in the tree's heart, a place that was mine where I could go when the weight got too heavy. Then I started building other things. Furniture for neighbors who couldn't pay, houses for people who had nothing, barns and sheds and cabinets and cradles. I built because building gave me a reason to stand. Every project was proof that I could still create something good in a world that had gone bad. Every finished piece was evidence that my hands still worked, that I still had something to offer. This room saved my life, not because it was a hiding place, but because it was a starting place. The first thing I built for myself, by myself when I had nothing else. I've hidden this room deliberately, sealed it behind walls so it won't be found by accident. I want whoever discovers it to have to work for it, to be building something themselves before they find it. Because that's who needs to find it. Someone who's building, someone who's trying, someone who understands that the act of creation is sometimes all we have to hold on to. If you found this place, you found yourself at the beginning of something, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. You're building not just with wood and nails, but with hope and determination, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. My message to you is simple. Build something that matters. Not for money or recognition or approval, but because the act of building, of making something that wasn't there before, is how we prove we're still alive. Still here, still capable of creating good in a world that often makes goodness feel impossible. I don't know who you are or when you'll find this, but I know you needed to find it, and I hope it gives you what it gave me, a place to start again. Build well. Build truly. Build something that will outlast both of us. Walter Garrett, April 1936. Philip read the letter 3 times. Then a fourth. Tears blurred the words. But he kept reading anyway, absorbing every sentence, every piece of his grandfather's heart, poured onto paper 90 years ago. Walter had stood where Philip stood, had felt what Philip felt, had contemplated ending it all because the weight of failure seemed heavier than the effort of continuing. And this room, this secret chamber hidden in the heart of the tree, had been his salvation. The first step back from the edge, the beginning of rebuilding a life from absolute ruin. Philip sat in his treehouse, holding his grandfather's confession, and understood finally what he'd been building all these months. Not just a structure, not just a tribute. He'd been building his own secret room, his own starting place, his own way back from the edge he'd been standing on, without fully realizing it. That evening he brought Brenda to see the chamber, showed her everything. The furniture, the tools, the toys Walter had carved during those dark years. And he gave her the letter to read. She read it in silence, standing in the doorway of that hidden room, and when she finished, she pulled him close and held him tight. "He found you," she whispered. "Across all those years, he found you exactly when you needed him. Or I found him. Does it matter which? No, I guess it doesn't." They stood together in the treehouse as evening settled in, and for the first time in months, Philip felt something shift inside him. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of it. The sense that maybe continuing was worth the effort after all. The weekend after finding the chamber, Philip called a family meeting. Not asking, not suggesting, telling. Trevor and Alison both needed to come home. There was something they had to see. They arrived on Saturday morning. Trevor and Stephanie in his sedan, Alison driving up from college with a friend she introduced as Madison. Everyone looked curious, but wary, unsure what this summons was about. Philip led them all out to the oak tree. The morning sun filtered through the branches, painting everything in gold and green. The treehouse looked complete now, solid and beautiful, more substantial than any of them had expected. "I want to show you something," Philip said. "Something I found. Something your great-grandfather left behind." He took them up one at a time. The ladder could only hold so much weight. First Trevor and Stephanie, then Alison and Madison, finally Brenda. They crowded into the main room of the treehouse, 7 people in a space meant for 2 or 3, but nobody complained. Philip showed them the hidden door first. Let them see how perfectly it had been concealed, how much care had gone into its construction. Then he led them into the chamber. The dust had settled since he'd opened it days ago, but everything remained as he'd found it. The small table and chair, the tools on their pegs, the carved toys on their shelf, the oil lamp waiting to be lit after decades of darkness. "Your great-grandfather built this in 1932, Philip said quietly. "During the Depression, when he'd lost everything." He handed Trevor the letter. "Read this out loud. Everyone needs to hear it." Trevor unfolded the yellowed paper carefully and began to read. His voice was steady at first, then wavered as he got deeper into Walter's words. When he reached the part about the rope, about standing on that branch with serious intentions, Alison made a small sound in her throat. By the time Trevor finished, everyone was crying. Even Madison, who'd never met any of them before today, had tears streaming down her face. "He was going to kill himself," Alison said, her voice small. "Great-great-grandpa Walter almost—" "But he didn't," Philip said. "He built this instead. And then he kept building. For years, decades, built his way back to a life worth living." Trevor folded the letter carefully, reverently. "Dad, His voice broke. "I'm so sorry. For everything I said. For thinking you were just— I didn't understand. How could you? I didn't understand myself until I found this." Stephanie was examining the carved toys, picking them up one by one with careful hands. "These are beautiful. The craftsmanship is incredible. He made them during the worst years," Philip said, "when he had nothing. Made toys for children who had even less. They spent 2 hours in and around the tree." Philip showed them everything. The compass, the carved bird, the photographs, the journal. Told them stories Mrs. Sutherland had shared, read passages from Walter's entries. Piece by piece, He built for them the picture of a man who'd survived the unsurvivable by refusing to stop creating. Alison sat in Walter's chair in the secret chamber, running her hands over the smooth wood of the armrests. This is where he came when things got too hard. Yes, and you built the treehouse because you needed the same thing. I think so. I didn't know it at the time, but yes. She looked at him with new eyes. I'm sorry I was embarrassed. Sorry I made it about me instead of understanding what you were going through. You were 19. The world looks different at 19. I'm still 19, she said. But maybe I can see better now. Before they left, Trevor pulled Philip aside. Stephanie and I have been talking about the wedding, about what we want it to mean. We'd like to have the ceremony here, by the tree, if that's okay with you. Philip felt his throat tighten. You're sure? I'm sure. This tree, it's family history. It's where our family almost ended and then didn't, where you found your way back. That feels like the right place to start a marriage. After everyone left, Philip found himself alone with Brenda on the treehouse platform. They sat side by side, watching the afternoon light shift through the leaves. What are you going to do now? She asked. I don't know exactly, but I have some ideas. Over the next week, those ideas took shape. Felix Russo stopped by, and Philip shared Walter's story with him. Felix listened, examined the chamber, read the letter, and sat quietly for a long time. You know what this needs to be? Felix said finally. A teaching space. A place where people can learn to build things that matter. What do you mean? I mean workshops, classes, bring in kids who need purpose, adults who've lost their way. Teach them carpentry, woodworking, craftsmanship. Use Walter's story as the foundation. Show them that building is about more than construction. It's about building yourself back up. The idea caught fire in Philip's mind. He called Mrs. Sutherland, who arrived the next day with a check from her late husband's estate. Ralph always said he wanted to invest in young people, she said. This seems like exactly the kind of thing he'd support. Within days, a plan emerged. They'd call it the Walter Garrett Workshop. Open it to anyone who needed it, at-risk youth, unemployed adults, anyone searching for purpose or direction. Philip would teach, with Felix helping on weekends. They'd use the property, the treehouse, the secret chamber as both classroom and inspiration. Mrs. Sutherland's grandson Oscar, 12 years old and hungry for male attention since his father had left, became the first unofficial student. He started showing up every afternoon after school, watching Philip work, asking questions, learning to handle tools with respect and care. Oscar's mother Patricia stopped by one evening to thank Philip. He talks about you constantly, about building things, about Walter's story. You've given him something I couldn't, a sense that creating matters more than consuming. Applications started coming in after a small article ran in the paper about the workshop plans. 12 young people wanted to be part of the first session, mostly from struggling families, kids who'd been told they weren't college material or smart enough or good enough. Kids who needed to build something to prove to themselves they could. Uncle Gerald surprised everyone by donating tools from his hardware store, surplus inventory, old stock, professional-grade equipment he'd been meaning to clear out. He helped Philip organize them in the shed, setting up workstations, creating a real workshop space. I was wrong about you, Gerald said while they worked. You're more like Walter than any of us. You understood what mattered. The week before the first workshop session, a local news station called. They wanted to do a story about the project, about Walter's legacy, about turning personal crisis into community benefit. Philip agreed reluctantly, knowing the exposure might help, but uncomfortable with the attention. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Philip told Walter's story, showed the chamber, explained the workshop's purpose. The response was overwhelming. Donations, volunteers, more applications from young people who wanted to learn. That night, Philip sat alone in the secret chamber where his grandfather had once contemplated ending his life, and instead chose to begin again. He held Walter's letter in his hands and spoke to the darkness. I think I understand now, Grandpa. You weren't just building furniture and houses. You were building hope, yours and everyone else's, and now I get to do the same. Outside, the oak tree stood strong against the autumn sky, waiting for what would come next. The morning of the first workshop session, Philip woke before dawn with his stomach tied in knots. He lay in bed, listening to Brenda's breathing beside him, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. What did he know about teaching? What made him think he could help these kids when he couldn't even help himself? Brenda's hand found his in the darkness. "You're awake, can't sleep. Nervous? Terrified?" She squeezed his hand. "You've already done the hardest part. You built something from nothing when you had every reason to quit. That's what you're teaching them, not carpentry, but how to keep going when everything says stop." He got up at 5:30 and made coffee, his hands steadier once he had something to do. By 7 he was at the oak tree, arranging workstations, double-checking that he had enough materials, enough tools, enough of everything. Felix showed up at 7:30 with boxes of safety equipment, goggles, gloves, dust masks. "You're going to do great," Felix said, reading Philip's anxiety. "Just remember, they're here because they need this. Same as you needed it. The students started arriving at 9, 12 of them ages 14 to 19, a mix of backgrounds and circumstances. Some came with parents who waited in cars, watching nervously. Others arrived alone on bikes or on foot. Oscar was first, grinning and eager, already claiming a workstation. A girl named Sophie came next, 16 and quiet, avoiding eye contact. 2 brothers, Marco and Vincent, arrived together, both sullen and suspicious. More trickled in, Casey, Brielle, Nolan, others whose names Philip tried frantically to memorize. The last to arrive was a boy about 16, Latino. With a court-mandated attendance form, he thrust at Philip without making eye contact. The form said his name was Luca Mendez. His expression said he'd rather be anywhere else. When everyone was settled, Philip stood in front of them feeling more exposed than he'd felt in his life. 12 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting, judging. He'd prepared a speech about safety procedures and workshop rules, but looking at their faces, some hopeful, some defiant, all of them guarded, he knew that wasn't what they needed to hear. "My name is Philip Garrett," he said. 6 months ago I lost my job. 22 years as a carpenter, and it didn't matter. I was out. Used up, done. That got their attention. A few sat up straighter. I came out here to my father's old property with nothing. No prospects, no plan, just the weight of feeling like I'd failed everyone who mattered. My wife, my kids, myself. He gestured to the oak tree. And I started building in that tree because I needed to remember I could still build something. Anything. He told them about finding the hollow space, about discovering Walter's artifacts one by one, about the compass and the carved bird and the journal, about the secret chamber and the letter that changed everything. My grandfather stood in this tree in 1932 with a rope, ready to end his life, because he'd lost everything, Philip said quietly. But instead of ending it, he started building. And he built his way back to a life worth living. The silence was complete now. Even Luca had stopped looking at his phone. That's what this workshop is about. Not just learning to use tools or build birdhouses. It's about learning that creating something, anything, is how we prove to ourselves that we matter, that we're still here, that we can make something good even when everything feels bad. He showed them the chamber, took them inside in small groups so everyone could see where Walter had hidden his pain and turned it into purpose. Let them hold the artifacts, read passages from the journal. Watched their faces change as they understood that this wasn't just a carpentry class, this was something deeper. When they were all back at their workstations, Philip introduced the first project, a simple birdhouse. Basic cuts, simple assembly, but room for creativity in the design. The goal isn't perfection, he said. The goal is completion, making something that didn't exist before you started, something that will last after you're gone. He circulated among the stations as they worked, offering guidance, correcting technique, encouraging effort. Oscar was a natural, his hands steady and sure. Sophie worked slowly but precisely, measuring everything twice. The brothers Marco and Vincent competed with each other, trying to work faster, better. Luca struggled. His cuts were uneven, his measurements off. After 20 minutes, he threw down his saw with enough force that everyone stopped to look. "This is pointless," Luca said, his voice tight with frustration. I'm not good at anything. This is just another thing I'm going to fail at. Philip walked over slowly, pulled up a stool, sat down next to Luca's workstation. The other students pretended to keep working, but were clearly listening. 3 months ago, I applied for a job at a lumber yard, Philip said. Stocking shelves. Minimum wage. They didn't even call me back. I had 22 years of professional experience, and I couldn't get hired to stack 2x4s. Luca glanced at him sideways. I sat in my truck in that lumberyard parking lot and cried like a child, Philip continued. Because I felt exactly like you just said, like I wasn't good at anything. Like I was going to fail at everything I tried. So what did you do? I went home and kept building. Not because I thought I'd suddenly get good at it, but because not building meant giving up. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. He picked up Luca's partially assembled birdhouse. This isn't perfect, but you know what? Mine wasn't either. The first cut I made on that treehouse was crooked. Had to redo it 3 times. Walter's journal talks about projects he messed up, pieces he had to rebuild. Nobody starts out good at this. You just start. Luca looked at the birdhouse, then at Philip. Something shifted in his expression. Not hope exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. Can you help me fix it? I can. But first I need you to pick up that saw you threw. Luca picked it up, and Philip showed him how to adjust his grip, how to let the saw do the work instead of forcing it. They worked together for the next hour, Philip's hands guiding Luca's, until the pieces started fitting together properly. By afternoon, everyone had made progress. The workshop was loud with the sounds of sawing and hammering, punctuated by laughter when someone made a mistake, by small celebrations when pieces fit together correctly. Oscar helped the younger students, natural teacher already emerging. Sophie's birdhouse was taking shape with elegant simplicity, and Luca's was coming together. Rough still, imperfect but real, something he was making with his own hands. When the session ended at 4, the students were reluctant to leave. Several asked when the next meeting was, if they could come back sooner. Luca stayed late, working on sanding his birdhouse smooth. When he was finally ready to go, Philip stopped him. "Hold on," he said, and went into the treehouse. He came back with the carved robin Walter had made for Philip's father. "This was made by my grandfather during the Depression," Philip said, placing it in Luca's hands. "When he had nothing. He made it anyway, because creating something beautiful mattered more than the circumstances he was creating it in." Luca held the bird like it might break. "I can't take this. You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you, with one condition. Someday when you're ready, you make something for someone else. Pass it forward." Luca's eyes were wet. He nodded, unable to speak, and carefully tucked the bird into his jacket pocket. After everyone left, Philip stood in the workshop space, surrounded by scattered sawdust and half-finished projects, and felt something he hadn't felt in months: purpose. Pure and simple and real. The first week of workshops transformed into a routine that felt less like teaching and more like building community. Students arrived early, stayed late, brought friends who wanted to learn. Luca showed up an hour before everyone else on the 3rd day, asking if he could work on a second project, a small box for his mother. "She keeps her jewelry in a plastic container," he explained, already sketching designs. "I want to make her something real." By the end of the 2nd week, all 12 students had completed their birdhouses. They signed them collectively, each name carved carefully into the base, along with Philip's and the date. Felix helped them mount it permanently in the oak tree's branches, a testament to what they'd built together. The transformation in Luca was the most dramatic. He arrived before anyone else now, stayed until Philip had to remind him to go home. His hands had developed the careful certainty that came with practice. More than that, his entire demeanor had changed. Shoulders back, eye contact direct, a quiet confidence replacing the sullen anger he'd worn like armor. Patricia, Oscar's mother, stopped by one afternoon to watch the session. Afterward, she pulled Philip aside. "Oscar hasn't stopped talking about this place," she said. "About you, about building things, about Walter's story. Before this, after his father left, he was so angry. Now he's excited about something. That's worth more than I can say." The community response continued to grow. Local businesses donated materials. Retired craftsmen volunteered to help teach. A furniture maker named Bernard offered to sponsor 2 students who showed particular aptitude, paying for advanced training if they wanted it. The news station that had done the original story called back. They wanted to do a follow-up piece showing the workshop in action, interviewing students about what they'd learned. Philip agreed, though the attention still made him uncomfortable. The crew came on a Saturday when all 12 students were present. They filmed the workshop in session, captured students working on projects, interviewed several of them about why they came and what it meant. When they interviewed Luca, he held up the jewelry box he'd finished for his mother. "Before I came here, I thought I was useless," Luca said to the camera, his voice steady. "Everybody told me I'd never amount to anything. Then Mr. Garrett told me about his grandfather, about how Walter almost gave up but didn't, about how building saved his life. And I realized, if I can build something good with my hands, maybe I'm not useless after all." The segment aired the following Tuesday. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations flooded in. Money, tools, materials, offers of space for expansion. More applications arrived from young people wanting to join. A woodworking supply company offered to sponsor the program with a grant. Trevor called that evening, his voice excited in a way Philip rarely heard. "Dad, Stephanie and I just watched the news segment. It's incredible what you've built. Not just the workshop, the whole thing. The impact you're having on these kids. I'm just teaching them to use tools." "No, you're not. You're teaching them the same thing Walter taught you, that creating something matters." "That they matter." Trevor paused. "Stephanie and I talked. We want to help, however we can. Money, time, whatever you need." After the call, Philip sat in the treehouse and opened his journal. He'd been writing in it regularly now, documenting the workshop sessions, the students' progress, his own evolving understanding of what he was building. "Today, Trevor told me he was proud of me," he wrote. "I realized I've spent months trying to prove my worth to my family, but they're not what I needed to prove it to. I needed to prove it to myself. And somehow, by teaching these kids to build, I've learned that my worth was never in question. It was just buried under a lot of fear and failure. Walter knew that. That's why he left the letter, not to tell me I was worthy, but to remind me that worth isn't something you earn, it's something you claim by refusing to disappear." The following weekend was Trevor and Stephanie's wedding. They'd kept it simple. 50 guests, the ceremony under the oak tree, reception on the property with tables Felix had helped Philip build. Philip walked Allison down a makeshift aisle while Trevor stood waiting with Stephanie. Both his children gave speeches that mentioned the tree, Walter's legacy, the way their father had found his way back to himself by building something that mattered. Mrs. Sutherland danced with Uncle Gerald, both of them laughing like they were young again. Oscar demonstrated proper saw technique to Stephanie's nieces and nephews. Luca showed up with his mother, who cried when she saw the jewelry box her son had made, running her fingers over the smooth wood like it was precious metal. Late in the evening, after most guests had left, Trevor asked Philip to sit with him in the secret chamber. They climbed into the tree together, father and son, and sat in the space Walter had built 90 years ago. "I need to tell you something," Trevor said. "For months I thought you were running away. Giving up, being irresponsible. I was so angry at you, I know, but I was wrong. You weren't running away. You were running towards something. And you found it." Trevor looked around the chamber. "I want to learn this. Woodworking, building, all of it. I want you to teach me. I want to be able to teach my kids someday, pass down what you're passing down." Philip felt his throat tighten. "I'd like that. And Dad, I'm sorry for not understanding sooner, for making you feel like you had to prove something to me. You were scared. I understand that now." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 men bridging the gap that fear and misunderstanding had carved between them. Later, after Trevor and Stephanie had left for their honeymoon, after the last guests had departed, Philip stood alone on the treehouse platform. Brenda found him there, wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You did it," she said softly. "Did what?" "Found your way home." He thought about the compass inscription, about Walter's journey from the edge of despair to a life of purpose. about his own journey from unemployment and shame to this moment, standing in a treehouse he'd built with his own hands, having just watched his son get married under a tree that held 3 generations of family history. "I think I did," he said. Finally. Below them, the workshop space was quiet, but ready for Monday's session. 12 students would arrive, eager to build, and Philip would be there to teach them, passing forward what Walter had passed to him. The oak tree stood strong against the night sky, holding them all. 6 months later, autumn had returned. The oak tree blazed with color, its leaves painted gold and crimson against a clear October sky. The workshop had grown beyond anything Philip had imagined that first uncertain morning. 2 full cohorts had graduated now. 24 young people who'd learned not just carpentry, but something deeper about their own capability and worth. Luca had been hired as an assistant instructor, helping new students the way Philip had helped him. He'd applied to trade school with a carpentry focus, earned a scholarship funded by Bernard's Furniture Company. When he worked with struggling students now, Philip saw echoes of himself, patient, encouraging, understanding that building things was really about building confidence. Oscar had completed his first major project, a bookshelf for his mother, solid oak with hand-carved details along the edges. Patricia had cried when he presented it to her, and Oscar had stood taller than Philip had ever seen him stand. The local builder who'd offered Philip work months ago had come through. Small jobs at first, custom cabinets, built-in shelving, restoration work on historic homes. Word spread about his craftsmanship, and steadier work followed. Not wealthy work, but enough. Enough to ease the pressure, to let Brenda cut back her hours, to pay bills without panic. Their marriage had shifted too, not healed completely. Some wounds took longer than 6 months, but moving in that direction. They talked now in ways they hadn't in years, laughed together, made plans that extended beyond just surviving to the next month. Trevor and Stephanie visited regularly. Trevor had started learning woodworking, coming out on weekends to work alongside his father. He was clumsy still, impatient with his own mistakes, but determined. Last week he'd completed a small table for their apartment, simple but solid, built with his own hands. "Stephanie's pregnant," Trevor told Philip one Saturday while they were sanding table legs. "We found out yesterday." Philip had stopped working, looked at his son. "You're going to be a father. Terrifying, right?" Trevor smiled. "But I keep thinking about what you've taught me. About Walter, about building things that last. I want to teach our kid that. Want them to know that their worth isn't in what they earn or own, but in what they create and give." Alison had changed her major to education, inspired by watching her father teach. She'd started volunteering at the workshop 1 weekend a month, helping younger students, discovering she had her father's patience and her great-great-grandfather's commitment to helping others find their way. On a crisp morning in late October, Philip sat in the secret chamber with a new leather-bound journal. He'd bought it specifically for this purpose, to begin his own record, his own message to whoever might find it decades from now. He dated the first page and began to write. "To my grandchildren, and to whoever else finds this room, my name is Philip Garrett. I'm the grandson of Walter Garrett, who built this chamber in 1932 when he'd lost everything. I found his letter 6 months ago, and it saved my life the way building this room saved his. I want to tell you what I've learned, so you'll know it when your own time comes to need it. Worth isn't measured in dollars or titles or possessions. It's measured in what you build when you have nothing, in what you give when giving seems impossible, in what you create that helps others find their way. My grandfather built furniture for people who couldn't pay him. I built a workshop for people who needed purpose. What will you build? What will you create that matters more than the creating itself? When everything falls apart, and it will, in ways you can't predict, remember this: you are not what you've lost. You are what you choose to do with your hands and your heart, when loss would be easier than continuing. Build something, anything. Build it carefully and honestly, and with the understanding that the act of creation is how we prove we're still alive. Still here, still capable of making good in a world that makes goodness feel impossible. This tree has stood for 300 years. It will stand for 300 more. It has weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser things, and it endures not through strength that never breaks, but through roots that go deep and branches that bend without breaking. Be like this tree. Root yourself in what matters. Bend when you must, but stand, always stand. Your great-great-grandfather taught me this. Now I'm teaching it to you. Someday you'll teach it to someone else. That's how legacy works. Not through money inherited or property passed down, but through wisdom shared and purpose discovered, and the stubborn refusal to let darkness win. Build something that matters. Not for recognition or reward, but because building is how we become fully human. I love you, though I may never meet you. The fact that you're reading this means you needed to find it. I hope it gives you what Walter's letter gave me, a reason to keep going. Build well. Build truly. Build something that will outlast us all. Philip Garrett, October 2025. He closed the journal and placed it on the shelf next to Walter's, 2 generations of wisdom waiting for whoever would need it next. Then he carefully closed the chamber door, not sealing it but protecting it, keeping it safe for the future. Outside, voices drifted up from below. Students arriving for the morning session, eager and loud with the energy of young people who discovered they could create. Philip climbed down from the treehouse and found them gathered around the workshop space. 15 this session, more than ever before. Luca was already helping them set up, demonstrating proper tool handling with the easy confidence of someone who'd found his place. Oscar was showing a new student how to read a tape measure. The morning sun caught the sign Felix had helped mount at the property entrance. The Walter Garrett Workshop. Build something that matters. Brenda appeared from the cabin with a thermos of coffee, kissed Philip's cheek, squeezed his hand. They stood together watching the students work, watching the legacy unfold in real time. Your grandfather would be proud, she said. I think so. I hope so, she smiled. I know so. The oak tree stood strong above them all, its branches reaching for the sky, its roots running deep into earth that had held it for 3 centuries. In its heart, hidden chambers held the stories of men who'd built their way back from the edge. And around its base, a new generation learned the old lesson, that creating something good was how you proved you mattered. Philip Garrett had found his way home, and in finding it, he'd built a path for others to follow.